With the rise of secularism, many human rights have been under attack, like freedom of speech, freedom to self-defense, and freedom to privacy.
It's illegal to display Nazi symbolism, a swastika, or deny the Holocaust. That's clear. Is it a crime to insult somebody in public?
Yes.
Yes, it is.
And it's a crime to insult them online as well?
Yes.
The fine could be even higher.
The offence of incitement to racial hatred involves publishing or distributing material which is insulting or abusive, which is intended to or likely to start racial hatred. So if you retweet that, then you're republishing that, and then potentially you're committing that offence.
The more and more we move away from our Christian foundations, the more it seems that human rights are threatened. Meanwhile, we are told Christians are the real authoritarians who want to remove our human rights. But the historical reality is much different. Without Christianity, human rights would probably not have been known as we have them now. Despite what many say, the belief in human rights is not something that is recognized across all cultures. Modern human rights came out of Judeo-Christian ideas, and without the biblical texts, we may never have discovered them. This is the story of how Christianity gave us human rights. Human rights are understood as inherent to all human beings, regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other status. They traditionally include the right to life, liberty, property, privacy, free speech, religion, self-expression, self-defense, and the pursuit of happiness, as well as freedom from slavery, torture, or unjust harm. In the ancient world, there was no concept of human rights for all people. Some cite the Cyrus Cylinder as the first declaration of human rights, but historians consider this anachronistic. Cyrus was not declaring universal human rights for all people, but continuing a common legal tradition in the ancient Near East that spoke of reforms within his territory. In no way was he declaring all humans have certain rights. The Persians were still brutal to their enemies and considered many groups to be beneath them. The development of human rights still had a long way to go, and through the rise of Christianity, human rights became a reality for us today. This process really began with the Hebrew Scriptures. In the ancient world, one's rights and privileges often depended on the social class you were a part of. Those lower on the hierarchical structure would not have things like freedom of religion, speech, or freedom from torture and slavery. You belonged to someone and were beholden to certain demands they put on you. Metaphysically, humanity was viewed as a race of slaves whose main purpose was to serve the gods. Therefore, most people had a low view of humanity. The king was called the image of the gods, and all were meant to serve at his pleasure to keep the gods appeased. The nobility had special rights and privileges that those of the lower class lacked. In the Code of Hammurabi, a slave was given a harsher punishment even if he committed the same crime as a nobleman. Aristotle later wrote, "From the hour of their birth, some are marked out for subjugation, others for rule." However, within the Hebrew Scriptures we see a different picture emerge. Genesis opens with the radical proclamation that all humans, both male and female, are equally the image of God and have an implicit right to rule over the earth. Humanity is not viewed as just a race of slaves, but rulers over all other creatures who can use the earth for their needs. Genesis gives us an implicit right to life, right to reproduce, and right to gather food and supplies. Jeremy Waldron says, "It offers a powerful account of the sanctity of the human person, and it seems to give theological substance to the conviction that informs all foundational thinking about human rights, that there is something about our sheer humanity that commands respect and is to be treated as inviolable, irrespective of or prior to any positive law or social convention." Genesis 9 says that no man can kill another unjustly, because all humans belong to the Creator as his image bearers. Nicholas Wolterstorff says, "The proscription against murder is grounded not in God's law, but in the worth of the human being. All who bear God's image possess, on that account, an inherent right not to be murdered. What is interesting is the implicit rights of Genesis transcend the human level. This is not something any man can grant or take away. Nor are they based on any social contract. They are rights given by the Creator himself, laying down universal rights that are equally granted to all. This is the beginning of the development of human rights. Joshua Berman notes this theme of equality continues throughout the Torah. One of its main points is to show that God is king, who has taken Israel on as a vassal state. But it does not grant a preferred status to an elite group who rules over the other people. Rather, the Torah treats all as equal before their true king, the Lord. From a literary standpoint, much of Deuteronomy is structured as a series of addresses to Israel, as a collective you. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. You shall feast in the temple before the Lord your God, happy in all the undertakings in which the Lord your God has blessed you. There is a fundamentally egalitarian streak at play here. With the exception of the priests and the Levites, no group is granted preferred status. All men are equal before the Lord, because all share the status of the subordinate king of the suzerainty treaty. The Torah advocates for an egalitarian society, where no tribe, class, or Israelite has absolute authority. Instead, there is a separation of powers, divided between different groups, with all presented as equal before the law of God. Bernard Levinson notes in the ancient Near East, and after the rise of the Davidic monarchy, the king was central for administering justice and giving laws. But in Deuteronomy, we see that priests and Levites were called to serve as members of a tribunal, and to serve in the centralization and purification of the cultic worship. A king is not called to serve in this endeavor, unlike what we see elsewhere. Levinson says, the authors of Deuteronomy pointedly rejected the Israelite and Near Eastern convention that makes the king central to the administration of justice. A position is reserved for a judge, who is in office for those days to hear cases. A tribunal is not composed merely of priests, but also a judge who serves for a time, thus allowing for separation of powers. Moreover, anyone is allowed to serve as a judge. This is not an office for an elite member of society. We also see no indication a king is needed to appoint judges and magistrates. Rather, the language is, you shall appoint judges and officers in all your towns that the Lord your God is giving you, according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. This power comes from the people themselves. Berman says, Deuteronomy does not say anything about which representative bodies should make this decision, how many judges are to be appointed, or hierarchy of the different levels of the judiciary. No doubt such apparatuses existed, but had Deuteronomy enshrined them in law, those bodies would have become the focus. In omitting the mechanisms, Deuteronomy retains its focus upon the citizenry as a whole. You, even as representatives, affect the appointment of judges. The ultimate authority and responsibility rests upon the people. God also lists another office, which is that of the prophet, individuals God will appoint to speak on his behalf, and can be seen as a check on the priests and judges. Additionally, we see references to a group known as the Elders of Israel, which began under Moses and were called to deal with various issues as well. So we see a lot of power invested in the people of Israel themselves, and treats them like sovereign individuals. All Israelite men were called to embark on a pilgrimage to the central place of worship and appear before God, similar to how an ancient subordinate king was required to travel to appear before his sovereign. In fact, Deuteronomy doesn't give much special status to the king. Chapter 17 says Israel has a right to elect to have a king if they desire to, but he must still be considered equal to his brothers. He is also not given a role of writing laws, but rather is called to obey the laws of Deuteronomy and remember his equal status with all Israelites before God. Once again, we see equality within the law of God, which transcends the human level. No man is responsible for creating laws. They come from God directly, establishing an early idea that humans can have certain rights. In 1 Samuel, we see the people of Israel elect to have Saul as their king, something which implies Israelites had a right to vote for or against. Kingship was not an institution thrust upon Israel. It was something they elected to have, suggesting they had certain rights they could exercise. We also see evidence of property rights. All Israelites retained rights to land given to them by God, as well as the rights to the fruit of the labor of their land. Throughout the ancient Near East, land was more often communally owned through the royal government. Most did not have rights to own land directly. But Israelites had rights to land grants given to them by God that even the king could not take away. 1 Kings 21 tells the story of King Ahab wanting the vineyard of Naboth. Surprisingly, Ahab could not simply seize the land. He had to request to buy it. Naboth cited his divine right to the land and was able to refuse the king. Ahab's wife Jezebel had to use trickery to obtain it. But what the story shows us is the Hebrew scriptures taught that Israelites retained some sense of property rights that even the king cannot violate. Nicholas Wolterstorff shows that throughout the Hebrew scriptures, we see constant calls for justice for the poor, widows, orphans, and foreigners, which suggests they are owed something they lack. This call also comes from God directly, suggesting what they are owed is a divine right to certain things, like a right to fair treatment, sustenance in order to survive, and justice for wrong done to them. As Isaiah 10 says, "Woe to those who decree iniquitous decrees, and the writers who keep writing oppression, to turn aside the needy from justice, and to rob the poor of my people of their right, that widows may be their spoil, and that they may make the fatherless their prey." It appears the scriptures suggest humans are owed certain things that many were being denied. Or in other words, they had rights that were not being honored. So the Pentateuch lays down an early concept of what could be called human rights. All who are in covenant with God are equal before Him and His law, have a right to life, a right to sustenance in order to survive, a right to property, justice, and had a right to participate in government. We find a much more egalitarian stream in the Hebrew Bible than what we find in texts from the surrounding cultures. As Joshua Berman said, "The equality of the members of the Israelite polity stem from their collective covenant relationship with God, in which each member is endowed with the status of subordinate king before the sovereign King of Kings. This is the metaphysical basis on which the notion of equality is founded. The Israelites are equalized, as it were, in their status before God as members of a covenant community, but no less so are equal in their standing before the law." These ideas carry over into the New Testament. Jesus' treatment of the lowest in society was unique in the ancient world. All deserve to be helped and cared for merely because they are human, and not because of social status or class. Paul and John taught that all are equal in Christ and have a right to become God's children who will share in the kingdom to come. David Ahn says, "This is a quite astonishing conception that seems to abolish in principle all inequities based on nationality, social status, and gender. Galatians 3:28 is not an isolated statement. 1 Corinthians 12:13, for example, mentions both nationality and social status in two parallel lines, formulated antithetically. The same two areas of equality are mentioned in Colossians 3:9-11. What we see in the teachings of Jesus in the New Testament is that all humans have value because they are loved by God. If the Creator loves all, then it follows they deserve dignity and fair treatment, which in turn means there are certain rights that must be respected and upheld. Nicholas Wolterstorff says, "Being loved by God gives a human being great worth, and if God loves equally and permanently each and every creature who bears the Imago Dei, then the relational property of being loved by God is what we have been looking for. Bearing that property gives to each human being who bears it the worth in which natural human rights inhere." Because of this, early Christians extended God's love to all, built orphanages for abandoned children, and taught the poor deserve to be cared for because they are loved by God. Christians also invented hospitals. Bart Ehrman says, Hospitals, defined as buildings or building complexes that provide both outpatient and inpatient health care by professionally trained doctors and nurses based on the most advanced medical knowledge of the day, were a Christian invention. The services they provided were free of charge. With the rise of monasteries, monastic leaders became concerned about the health of their communities, since people gave up their former lives to join the monastery, and it involved rigorous asceticism. Healthcare facilities were created to help the sick. Andrew Crislip says, monastics had access to inpatient hospital care and outpatient ambulatory care. This care was guaranteed and free of charge. Monastics were treated by doctors and nurses using the standard medical treatment of Greek and Egyptian medicine. They were offered material and emotional comfort in their time of need, an exemption from their normal responsibilities of work, diet, and prayer. Monastics were furthermore guaranteed social inclusion and freedom from ostracism, and guaranteed comfort and care in their old age. The care of the sick monastic was one of the central features of monastic life, and concern for the sick is apparent throughout early monastic rules and instructions. Basil the Great sold his possessions and took up the monastic life. He often preached the wealthy were required to give up their possessions to feed the poor. When he was made Bishop of Caesarea, he built a facility to distribute food to those in need and house as many as possible. But it also had a healthcare facility for the sick. Inpatient and outpatient services were provided free of charge to those who could not afford them. This was the first known general hospital in the Western world, and the model was soon replicated elsewhere. By the 5th century, hospitals were built in Rome, Ostia, Antioch, Constantinople, and Edessa. For Christians, the care of the sick and needy was a vital part of preaching the gospel, because all had rights given by God that needed to be honored. The status of humanity was raised by Christian teachings. Bart Ehrman says, before Christianity came along, almost no one of means in the Roman Empire, except Jews, urged the rich to help the poor. Many argued against doing so. This seems weird to many of us, but it is well documented. There was almost no concern for the hungry and homeless in ancient Greek and Roman moral discourse. No sense that the wealthy should contribute funds to their welfare, and no sense that institutions should be created to help the destitute. Church fathers began to use language that invoked human rights. St. Basil said, that bread which you keep belongs to the hungry, that coat which you preserve in your wardrobe to the naked, those shoes which are rotting in your possession to the shoeless, that gold which you have hidden in the ground to the needy. Wherefore, as often as you were able to help others and refused, so often did you do them wrong. Similarly, John Chrysostom said, even if he is the most wicked of all men, let us free him from hunger. We show mercy on him not because of his virtue, but because of his misfortune. In other words, the poor have natural rights to certain things because they are loved by God. We have a duty to honor those rights by caring for the least of us. Gregory of Nyssa was the first to argue slavery should be abolished. His reasoning was that if all humans are the image of God, then no man can own another human, since we all equally belong to God. God said, let us make human beings in our own image and likeness. When we are talking about one who is in the image of God, who has dominion over the whole earth, and who has been granted by God authority over everything on the earth, tell me, who is the seller and who the buyer? Only God has this kind of power, or one might almost say not even God. For Scripture says that the gifts of God are irrevocable. God would not make a slave of humankind. It was God who, through his own will, called us back to freedom when we were slaves of sin. If God does not enslave a free person, then who would consider their own authority higher than God's? How can people be sold who have dominion over the earth and everything on the earth? From the tenets of Scripture, church fathers began to speak of humans as having inherent rights that must be respected by all. By the time of the Middle Ages, we see authors begin to speak of human rights more explicitly. Brian Tierney says that the humanistic jurisprudence of the 12th century, especially the writings of the medieval decretists, may provide a better starting point for investigating the origin of natural right theories than either 14th century nominalism or the nascent capitalism of the early modern world. In the 12th century, Godfrey of Fontaines argued if a poor man stole a loaf of bread from a rich neighbor, he could not be charged with theft, since he had a natural right to survive and live. William of Ockham developed a systematic theory of rights, including property rights. By the 1300s, canon lawyers recognized at least 5 natural rights: the right of the poor to necessities of life, the right of self-preservation, rights to property, rights to a fair trial, and the right of self-defense. These ideas would later inspire Enlightenment ideas about natural rights that led to things like the creation of the Bill of Rights in the U.S. Constitution. But the goal of canon law was to create a culture where all were equal in the eyes of God. Similarly, Tom Holland notes in the Middle Ages, priests began to push the right of individuals to marry who they choose. The ancient cultural norm was that parents would have a say in who their children could marry. Marriages were often arranged for families or political alliances. But the scriptures taught individuals had freedom of choice. This was understood as including the freedom to choose to marry who you loved, and not forced into something against your will. Priests were authorized to join couples without the knowledge of their parents, or even their permission. It was consent, not coercion, that constituted the only proper foundation of a marriage. The church, by pledging itself to this conviction and putting it into law, was treading on the toes of patriarchs everywhere. Here was a development pregnant with implications for the future. Opening up before the Christian people was the path to a radical new conception of marriage, one founded on mutual attraction, on love. Inexorably, the rights of the individual were coming to trump those of family. God's authority was being identified, not with the venerable authority of the father to impose his will on his children, but with an altogether more subversive principle: freedom of choice. In other words, women and men had an individual right to choose who they would marry. This was a Christian concept that was radical when it was introduced, but it slowly became the norm to the point that we now take it for granted. The right to freedom in many matters was largely inspired by biblical passages. James Simpson says, "Evangelical singular liberty is a purely theological concept, with first-century gospel sources, particularly the letters of Paul, e.g. Romans 8:21, the glorious liberty of the sons of God, 2 Corinthians 3:17. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. And above all, Galatians 5:1. Stand fast therefore in the liberty, wherewith Christ has made us free." Eventually, Christians began to realize these rights they believed in extended to those beyond their religion. When Europeans discovered the Americas, they often treated the native populations inhumanely because they believed they were inferior. To justify the inhumane treatment, they relied primarily on Aristotle instead of Christian writers. Meanwhile, priests like Bartolomé de las Casas pushed back against this injustice, arguing they are our brothers, and Christ gave his life for them. All the peoples of the world are humans, and there is only one definition of all humans, and of each one, that is that they are rational. The teachings of the Bible were what mattered, and they taught that everyone had rights from God that must be respected. Europeans could not go around treating natives like animals. They must see themselves as equal with all. These Christian ideas were also manifesting in the Reformation, whose leaders taught salvation was an individual choice. Neither the state nor the religious authorities could mediate on our behalf. All had to work out their own salvation with fear and trembling. James Simpson says, "For contemporary liberals, perhaps the greatest gain of the Reformation is precisely the growth of individuality and interiority, seen as signs of authentic agency." Martin Luther said, "For over the soul, God can and will let no one rule but himself. Therefore, where temporal power presumes to prescribe laws for the soul, it encroaches upon God's government and only misleads and destroys the souls." The choice of religion was an individual matter. Thus it followed individuals must be given freedom to decide on these matters, allowing the concept of religious freedom to continue to develop into a full-blown right. Joseph LeConte said, Virtually every important defense of religious freedom in the 17th century, the liberal politics of William Penn, Roger Williams, Pierre Baillet, and John Locke, took Luther's insight for granted. The only narrow way which leads to heaven is not better known to the magistrate than to private persons, wrote Locke in a letter concerning toleration. And therefore I cannot safely take him for my guide, who may probably be as ignorant of the way as myself, and who certainly is less concerned for my salvation than I myself am. Tom Holland says, the evolution of the concept of human rights, mediated as it had been since the Reformation by Protestant jurists and philosophers, had come to obscure its original authors. It derived not from ancient Greece or Rome, but from the period of history condemned by all right-thinking revolutionaries as a lost millennium. It was an inheritance from the Canon lawyers of the Middle Ages. As Christian thinkers were developing this language of human rights, we see the fruits of these ideas began in the Middle Ages. Toby F. notes a new cultural shift was underway that revolutionized the legal tradition of Europe. One result of this unparalleled structural transformation was the creation of new organizational principles and political ideas, such as constitutional government, consent in political decision-making, the right of political and legal representation, the power of adjudication and jurisdiction, and even the power of autonomous legislation. Aside from the scientific revolution itself, and perhaps the Reformation, no other revolution has been as fateful for new social and political developments as the legal revolution of the European Middle Ages. Europeans began to form guilds and organizations to collectively defend and argue for their rights. Merchant guilds, associations of doctors and other professionals, charitable organizations, and towns began to collectively bargain for rights and privileges. Villages and urban conclaves began to form as legal entities to self-govern. Huff notes these cultural shifts then led to the development of parliaments and constitutional democracies. The first regional parliament was established in Spain in 1188. The concept quickly spread to other parts of Spain and France. Constitutional regimes quickly spread across Europe. In England, the Magna Carta was signed, which limited the king's power and established law as a power in its own right. It also contains provisions for widows, heirs, and the rights of cities and boroughs. The law was set above all humans, including kings and popes. Huff says, by the opening of the 15th century, European law had established legal principles restricting the actions of the prince, but not only that, the pope. The principle that the pope too is subject to natural law and may not abridge a defendant's right of self-defense was established in a notorious case involving the Medicis and the attempt of the Pazzi family to eliminate them violently. Because individuals needed to work out their own salvation and legal status through self-governance, the idea of the separation of church and state was developing. The state could no longer force a religion on the people. Tom Holland notes the seed was first planted by Jesus himself, when he said, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and render unto God the things that are God's. This idea laid down a separation between the spiritual and political world. It was developed more by St. Augustine, and then began to manifest in the Reformation. Article 28 of the Augsburg Confession sets out a separation of church and state, mainly because the reformers were worried more about the Roman Church meddling in the affairs of the state. Increasingly then, the separation of church from state was an upheaval manifest across the whole of Christendom. Wherever a priest was called upon to minister to the laity, even in the humblest, the most isolated village, there the impact of Reformatio could be felt. The establishment of the Roman Church as something more than merely a first among equals, as a general form of all clergy and all churches, gave clerics across the Latin West a common identity that they had not previously possessed. With all these ideas developing through the Christian tradition of the Middle Ages, we see human rights finally blooming into what they are today. Samuel Moyne notes it was Christian thinking in the United Nations that led to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But the general thesis of Christian human rights is that through the lost and misremembered trans-war era, it is equally, if not more viable, to regard human rights as a project of the Christian right, not the secular left. Ian Benson said, the major proponents of human rights as it was developed and codified in the 20th century, were themselves Christians. People like Jacques Maritain from France and Charles Malik in Lebanon. Religious morality was central for grounding human rights in ways that secularism never can. And it was the same Christian principles we saw throughout this video that led to human rights as we know them today. All have rights that transcend the human level. All humans have inherent dignity because we are the image of God and loved by our Creator. Since all humans were created by God, it followed that all humans share this inherent value, and with this came rights we were granted by God. It then follows that humans have certain rights that must be protected from authoritarian governments that would attempt to limit rights or remove them in attempts to recreate society, like what we saw in atheist communist societies. As the Declaration of Independence put it, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Christianity was a crucial aspect that gave rise to ideas that led to human rights. Samuel Moyne says, "The ideal of religious freedom originated in and long remained tethered to the self-conscious attempt to preserve an explicitly and pervasively Christian society, most especially after a certain point, against the frightening threat of secularism. Though European secularism now attracts criticism for its covert Christianity, most often the ideal of religious freedom served the project of overt Christianity, which left secularism a frequently embattled ideal." Robert A. Seipel says, "Human value, human choice, and human hope are derived from the fundamental beliefs of the Christian faith. Human rights and the vigorous pursuit of these rights are part of the inescapable tapestry of Christianity. The rationale for Christian involvement in the human rights arena is one of the most natural understandings to emerge from this religion." With the rise of modern secularism, governments have become more authoritarian, which should not surprise us. Without the religious basis for human rights, government officials have no sacred calling to protect rights, like freedom of speech, self-defense, religion, privacy, or freedom from torture. As John Witt Jr. said, "The regime of law, democracy, and human rights needs religion to survive." Roland to Salem demonstrated that Christianity led to more citizen empowerment, voice and accountability, and political transformation. Daniel Treisman found that Protestantism plays a role in monitoring and denouncing state officials, is associated with lower corruption, and helping establish a pronounced distinction between church and state. Lipset and Lenz concluded that Protestantism reduces corruption, in part because of its association with individualistic, non-familistic relations. Human rights are now threatened more than ever, because without the underlying religious foundation, there is no reason for governments to care about human rights. If there is no God, there is no lawgiver who established rights. Governments become the new gods who grant them for us, and they can be revoked if government officials see fit. It is imperative we see where human rights came from, and understand that without their Christian foundation, human rights will not flourish. It is Christianity that is most responsible for human rights, and without them, we will be worse off, led by authoritarians who believe they are the ones granting us rights. Without Christianity, we have no hope. You made it to the end of this video, which means this message matters to you. If you want to see more content like this reaching people for Christ, you can help make it happen. Your support makes these videos possible. Click the link below and donate today. And if you want to go even deeper, consider joining our Patreon community. You'll get early access to videos, behind-the-scenes content, and a place to connect with others passionate about this mission.